Hey everybody, in today's video I'm going to talk about Sony's A9II mirrorless camera. I'm going to cover the external body controls. Of course, there's tons of things that you can do by going into the menu system, and we're going to cover those too as well in later videos. But for today, I just want to cover the external knobs and controls and get those set up for you for wildlife photography and specifically for birds in flight. Now, if you have a Sony A9 camera, the first version of this body, this video will be helpful as well. There are just a few changes between the A9 and the A9II. So come with me now, and we're going to go into the external controls of this camera body. Starting off on the top of the camera, we have our on-off switch here with the shutter button in the middle of that. And I recommend deactivating that for focus and putting that onto a back button focus and just allowing this button to trip the shutter. Real quickly, the way that you deactivate your shutter button so that it only trips the shutter and doesn't activate the autofocus is you go into your menu system, you toggle over to what I call the chapter 1 of camera, then you go over to page 6 in that chapter, you go down here, autofocus with shutter. The default is that it's on. You want to turn that off and then hit your menu button, and now your shutter button will only take pictures. It will not activate the autofocus. Moving over to the left hand side, we've got our drive modes here, and you actually have to press the center button here in order to turn those, and I leave that on high speed shutter, and that gives me 20 frames a second for birds in flight and getting nice sequences like this. Then you've got your mid-range continuous shooting and your low-range continuous shooting. Mid-range, when using electronic shutter, gives you 10 frames a second, and low-range gives you 5 frames per second. Of course, then you have a self-timer, and you have a bracket mode. Then you have your focus mode dial here also on the left-hand side of the camera. You have to depress the button in the front in order to spin this dial. You have a single autofocus setting. That's for motionless subjects. The camera will focus once on whatever you choose as your subject. Then you have your continuous focus mode. That's most useful for birds in flight and anything that moves. The camera will continually focus on it as long as you press down your focus button. Then you have a DMF button, which stands for direct manual focus, and that will autofocus on the subject but then allow you to fine-tune it by using your manual focus ring. And then you have a complete MF setting, which is for manual focus. If the autofocus isn't working for some reason, you can manually focus on your subject by putting this setting there. Moving over to the right hand side of the camera, you've got your main mode dial here. You do have to depress this center button in order to spin this dial to get your various modes. You've got numerous choices here. You've got a custom mode 1, 2, and 3. You've got a full manual mode. You've got S for shutter priority mode, A for aperture priority mode, P for program auto mode, a full auto mode. S and Q is a very cool feature. That's a short and quick movie mode. You can get scenes that look like this. And then you've got your regular movie mode here. Also on the right hand side of the camera, you've got your custom number 1 and custom number 2 buttons. Those can be set up to do any number of functions depending on what you decide. I've got mine set up to do custom 1 is white balance and custom 2 is focus area change. Real quickly on how to set up your custom button number 1 and 2, which are on the top of the camera. You access your menu system. You toggle over to chapter 2, which is a camera with a number 2 on it. You go down and go across until you get to page number 9. You can see it here. Custom key. Hit your center button to go into custom keys. Now you have 4 pages of custom keys that you can set. And the one that you want to do for the top of the camera is on page number 3. It's the top. You can see that I have mine set up to do white balance on custom number 1, and custom button 2 I have set up to do focus area. you've got your front dial to spin to change your aperture or your shutter speed, and your back dial to change the aperture or the shutter speed depending on which mode you're in. Then you've got your exposure compensation dial here also on the right hand side of the camera. This is a bit of a change from the original A9 to the Sony A9 II in that this A9 II has a locking mechanism, so you depress it until it pops up and then you can spin your exposure compensation dial. Now let's say you're starting out at the 0 point photographing a medium tonality bird such as a mallard or a great blue heron. And then you're going to switch over and do some birds that are white. And of course you don't want to overexpose those, so you're going to dial in a little bit of minus compensation, say 2/3 of a stop or a full stop, and photograph something that has white so you can keep the feather detail and not lose that. So when I'm out in the field, I actually leave that button unlocked so I can easily make changes to my exposure compensation. Then when I'm going to put away my camera, I lock that button back down so it doesn't make some changes that I'm not aware of while I'm putting it into my bag or taking it out of my bag. Moving on now to the back of the camera, we'll start out with our C3 button over here on the left hand side. I find that that button's a little bit hard to get to when I'm shooting wildlife photography, so I have it set up to do a depth of field preview, which is only useful when you're doing landscapes from a tripod. The way you set that up is the same as you set up your other custom buttons. You come into Chapter 2, Page 9, Custom Key, you hit your center button, and you toggle down to number 4, and you can see that I've got it as an aperture preview button. Then you have your menu button also on the left hand side of the camera. That brings up all your menus. And there are 6 different chapters, and the way that you move from chapter to chapter is with your front dial here, and when you get to the chapter that you want to use, then you use your control wheel to go down, and then there are numerous pages. It tells you what page you're on right here. We were going to cover each menu item one by one in a later video. Then on the back of the camera, you've got this button with a red dot on it. That's a dedicated start and stop movie button. I leave it at that default. It's very useful to have. That way when you want to do a quick movie of something that you see while you're out in the field, you do not have to go up into your main mode dial up here and switch that. You just touch that button, it starts the movie with the settings that you have set up in your custom menu, and then you touch it again and it stops that movie. Then you have your AF on button here. The default is that activates the autofocus system, and I leave it there. It's very useful. That's your back button focus, of course. You could assign that to something else in your custom key settings, but you can see here that number 3 AF on button I have set to AF on. Then you've got your AEL button over here on the right hand side of the camera. That's an automatic exposure lock button. If you're shooting a subject where the light is changing and you want to lock in a certain exposure, then you would press and hold that button. I don't find that very useful to do that, so I've assigned that button to recall my custom settings number 1. And the way that I set that up is going into the menu, Chapter 2, Page 9, Custom Key, and you can see that number 2 is the AEL button, but I've got it set up to recall custom hold number 1. Then you have this button here that Sony calls a multi-function button. On the original A9 body, that button was smooth, but on this A9II body, they've made it rough so that you can feel the difference in the buttons just with your thumb as you're going around the back of the camera. Now by default what that button does is it moves the focus area around your frame. But I don't find that that's all that useful. So what I have it do is I have it recall custom hold number 2. So I go into Chapter 2, Page 9, Custom Operations. And then once I'm in the custom key area, I go over to Page 2, and it happens to be labeled number 1. and I have it to recall custom hold 2. So that way, when I'm out in the field, I can get different settings just by holding that button down. Next up is the FN button, or the function button. What that does is it pulls up 12 menu items so you can change those very quickly without having to go into any other menus. Things like focus area, exposure compensation, which card to record to, and so on. You can customize that any number of ways, and I'm going to make another video to show exactly how I set up mine. Up on the right hand side of the camera is our main control wheel. That does a variety of functions both in the shooting mode and in the review mode of the camera. And you get to those and change those, what it can do, by accessing your menus, going over to chapter number 2, that's the camera with a 2 on it, and once you're in chapter 2 you want to page over, you see my page changing there, to page 9, custom key. And then you select that by hitting the center of your control wheel, and once you're in this area, the custom key area, then you want to go to page number 2. And you can see highlighted in red what we're going to change. So toggle down to number 2, you see it's the center of the control wheel, and I have that set up for an autofocus manual focus toggle. What that means is that I hit that button once when I'm out in the field and I can do manual focus. Then I hit it again and I can be back into autofocus. I have number 3 not set for anything right now. Number 4 is by default the ISO and I leave it there. And number 5 is pressing the button down, and I don't have that set up for anything currently as well. And while we're over on this side of the camera, let's talk about the main control wheel for your reviewing options. This is your main review button here. And of course, when you press that, it brings up the pictures that you've taken. And you can scroll through those very quickly by spinning your control wheel, or you can go through those a little slower one at a time by pressing to the right or to the left to go backwards through your images. And then of course you get to a picture and let's say you want to delete one. So you can come down here, this is your trash can button, that while you're in review mode, you can of course delete pictures here by pressing that button, moving up to the delete, and pressing the center of your control wheel to delete a picture that way. Okay, so let's do a quick review on the Sony A9 body. It's highly customizable for how your preferences are, but I'll review how I do mine. I grab the camera with my right hand. My index finger just takes pictures on the shutter button. My main focus button is the AF on button, and that's going to do my follow focus for birds in flight. I hold that down while taking the picture with my index finger. Then if something happens and I want to do a movie, all I have to do is move my thumb over to the dedicated movie button, and I can start the movie with that button and then stop the movie with that button. I don't have to touch anything else. I also have my custom settings number 1 set up on this AEL button so that if I find a perched bird that isn't moving, I've got different settings there, and I just push and hold that button and I can do those types of settings. My custom hold number 2 settings are here on this button here, and I can feel the difference with my thumb. And then if I want to do a manual focus, I just move my thumb down a little bit further to the center of the control wheel, push that, and it toggles to a manual focus. And then I push it again and it goes back to the autofocus. And then if I want to bring in the APS-C digital zoom, then I hit custom number 4 button down here. Again, it's a toggle. I hit it. It brings up that center part of the frame for a closer view of whatever it is, and then I hit it again and I'm back to full frame. So there's your setup of how I shoot wildlife photography with the A9II. So as you can see, there's a ton of things to cover with the Sony A9II camera body, and this video just covered the external body controls. In future videos, I'm going to dive into the menu system and show you how to get that set up for your wildlife photography, for your action and birds in flight. Some people say that the menu system on the Sony cameras is really complicated. I don't find that at all. I shot Canon cameras for many years and just recently moved over to the Sony system for the autofocus capabilities, and I'm very excited about it. It's working perfectly, and I appreciate you watching my video. Thanks a lot.